Hello, friends, wherever this finds you in the world. Welcome to another lesson from Jefferson Theological Seminary. My name is Dr. Nathan Amerson in the state of Oregon, USA, and today we are exploring theories of the Atonement. The person of Jesus Christ is well attested historically, and the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most well attested events in history. When Jesus died, was buried, and rose again on the third day, he enacted one of the greatest miracles of history, atonement for sin. What does atonement mean? The word atonement comes from the Old English, in which the phrase "at one meant" was sort of smashed together to make a new word. The etymology prior to the 16th century, as well as its origins and roots in Latin, are unclear. But since Elizabethan times, the word has meant to bring two who are separate into one ment, or being one. Some definitions for atonement include reconciliation, where two parties are brought back into agreement, and it includes other terms which are important in theology, such as expiation, redemption, restitution, and propitiation. And for these, we shall get into further definitions as we go along. So, in his self-sacrificial act on the cross, what did Jesus accomplish? There is some mystery to this, as is attested in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. In verses 6 through 8, Paul says this, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age, who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." So it is very interesting here to note that the rulers of this age, and Paul seems to imply both in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense, that these rulers did not actually know what they were doing when they took Christ to the cross. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So in both a physical and a spiritual sense, it seems there's a certain mystery wrapped around the act of Christ going to the cross, although Christ himself knew precisely what he was doing. And he chose to give in to the will of the Father, to sacrifice himself in this way, and in so doing, taking upon himself the sins of the world, sins so extreme that the Father had to actually look away in anguish. He could not see his Son suffering so. But in so doing, Christ attained atonement, that is, at one ment, bringing fallen, sinful humanity back into a right standing and right relationship, a one ment, if you will, with God the Father himself. In Christ's act, a miracle occurred which allowed people in a broken and fallen world to their created state. That is, relationship with God. That is why the devil and powers of this world, who thought they were merely murdering the Messiah, would not have done so had they understood the miracle. Through the centuries, there have been a variety of viewpoints on this, which is what constitutes today's lecture. For the following discussion, I am indebted to an author named Stephen D. Morrison, and a link to his site has been included at the end of this discussion. I turn now to Morrison, and on his website, he breaks down in a very brief article 7 theories of the atonement summarized. This is from the year 2014. You see, there are a number of viewpoints, a number of theories that sort of attempt to explain what the atonement means for humanity, for God, for Christ in his incarnated state. The first is called moral influence theory. Moral influence theory. And this is quite early in the early church. And it simply means that Jesus Christ came and died in order to bring about a positive change for humanity. So that is that Christ, in his sacrificial death, was working to bring a moral influence to the rest of society. Stephen says the most notable name here is that of Augustine from the 4th century, whose influence has almost single-handedly had the greatest impact upon Western Christianity. He affirmed the moral influence theory as the main theory of the atonement, alongside the ransom theory, which we will get into in just a moment. So in this way, Christ is seen as a sort of catalyst to reform society. He's inspiring men and women to follow his example, to live good moral lives. And this is a theory of the atonement that is actually acceptable to a large number of unbelievers, especially Buddhists. Buddhists can look at the life and person of Jesus Christ and can even admit that he sacrificed himself, with the expectation that the end result of that self-sacrifice is that humanity has been bettered. Humanity has now an example of a life well lived, a life of someone who is willing to sacrifice themselves for others. He says this in turn creates a strong emphasis on free will as the human response to follow Jesus' example. So in the moral influence theory, the human person, it seems, is sort of guided or has impetus along their path to live the better life that goes beyond themselves, which human beings, I think, inherently recognize that we are not good, we are weak, we are sinful, we are self-serving. And so the moral influence theory sort of enacts like a sense of betterment upon humanity or humankind, if you will. Yet, clearly, there's much more at stake. There's much more at play here, as we can see in the scriptures. Although Christ is crucified as a martyr due to the radical nature of his moral example, the moral theory, the moral influence theory, emphasizes Jesus Christ as our teacher, our example, our founder and leader. And ultimately, our first martyr, the first person who sacrificed himself for the greater good, for something larger than himself. Yet, it's clear that from an Orthodox Christian perspective, there's far more at play here when it comes to the person of Jesus Christ. And so we come to number 2, the ransom theory. The ransom theory of the atonement is one of the first major theories for the atonement. It is often held alongside the moral influence theory and usually deals more with the actual death of Jesus Christ, what it actually means and the effect it has upon humanity. So in the early church, we find that the ransom theory begins to actually become the primary theory of the atonement. That is, what did the atonement accomplish? And the early church fathers are trying to work this out. Now, essentially, it teaches that Jesus Christ died to pay a ransom, as one would to ransom a hostage or someone who is kidnapped, to ransom them from the enemy. They're being held by the enemy for a price. You pay the price is the ransom. That person is released from the clutches of the enemy. Yet the ransom view is essentially flawed in that, and I'm going to go back to Stephen Amerson here. Essentially, this theory claimed that Adam and Eve sold humanity over to the devil at the time of the fall. So Adam and Eve choose wrongly, they sin, they rebel against God, and in so doing sold humanity over to the devil so that the devil had primacy or held power over the future generations of humanity that would emerge. Justice required that God pay the devil a ransom, for the devil did not realize that Christ could not be held in the bonds of death. So Christ gives himself up. The devil does not realize that Christ cannot be held, yet God is required to pay to the devil a ransom to redeem humanity. Once the devil accepted Christ's death as a ransom, this theory concluded justice was satisfied and God was able to free us from Satan's grip. Redemption, in this theory, means to buy back or purchase the human race from the clutches of the devil. However, this theory has some obvious weaknesses. and that is, does the devil have power over the Almighty God? The answer is no. So God has ultimate power over humanity and ultimately over the fallen angels and Satan himself. God is not beholden to Satan in this way. So that's the weakness, theologically and scripturally speaking. And so we have to realize that the ransom theory has to be expanded a bit, which comes later, especially under Aquinas, who posited that, in fact, the ransom that Christ pays in his act of death on the cross is to God himself, who is the ultimate power in the universe and is not to Satan, because God is the one who has been offended, has been shortchanged, who is owed a payment of a debt. And Christ pays that debt back to God himself because humanity has chosen to walk away from their created relationship with God the Father. So that's a far better way to see ransom theory. Although, if you read medieval theology, one will certainly discover that ransom theory, especially in terms of a ransom paid to Satan, to the devil, is quite well discussed. We move now to number 3, Christus Victor. Christus Victor. This is Latin for Christ is victorious. Christ is the victor. Christ is the winner. Classically, the Christus Victor theory of atonement is widely considered to be the dominant theory for most of the historical Christian church. So that is from the 5th to 15th century, so approximately 1,000 years, or one half of the history of Christendom. In this theory, Jesus Christ dies in order to defeat the powers of evil, such as sin, death, and the devil, in order to free mankind from their bondage. This is related to the ransom view, with the difference being that there is no payment either to the devil or God. Rather, within the Christus Victor framework, the cross did not pay off anyone, but defeated evil, thereby setting the human race free. So Christ is victorious. Christ is all-powerful in the Christus Victor theory of the atonement, and in overcoming sin, in overcoming death, in overcoming the devil, has proved himself to be the victorious master of the universe and over the created world. We move now to number 4, the satisfaction theory. The satisfaction theory, and this is primarily propagated by Anselm in the 12th century of Middle European history. So Anselm of Canterbury proposed a satisfaction theory for the atonement. In this theory, Jesus Christ's death is understood as a death to satisfy the justice of God. Satisfaction here means restitution, the mending of what was broken, and the paying back of a debt. So, in a way, we see ransom theory is kind of rolled into satisfaction theory, in that it's the paying back of a debt. However, Anselm emphasizes the justice of God and claims that sin is an injustice that must be balanced. So when the human race sinned against God, they essentially incurred a debt against God's honor that must be repaid in order for human beings to be able to be returned to a right relationship with God. Well, guess what? Human beings are not God. They are not able to repay an infinite debt to the God and the creator of the universe himself. Who is able to repay this debt? There's only one, and it is God's Son himself, God himself, Jesus Christ, who becomes the propitiation for our sin and pays back the debt that is owed to God because of the sin of human beings. Now, Anselm was and has been roundly criticized for this general theory because of its reliance upon a recognition culturally of the feudal system that existed in Europe at the time. That is, where the lower lord held his lands as a fief of the higher lord and of the higher lord and of the king, ultimately. And so that this feudal system, and Anselm understood it and incorporated this concept of the feudal system, in that what is owed to God is a debt to sin, which is repaid only by the death of Jesus Christ. Now, with that, we come to number 5, the penal substitutionary theory. The penal substitutionary theory. This is a development of the Reformation, Calvin, Zwingli, etc. The Reformers, specifically Calvin and Luther, took Anselm's satisfaction theory and modified it slightly. They added a more legal or forensic framework. So that has to do with, like, there's a crime, there's evidence of the crime, there's a person who's being charged based on the evidence of that crime. So we imagine a courtroom scene in which it is being played out. Now, within this framework, they implemented this notion of the cross as satisfaction. The result is that within penal substitution, Jesus Christ dies to satisfy God's wrath against human sin. So God's wrath is a concept that is put forward particularly by Calvin, where Calvin notes that because of God's incredibly transcendent holiness, God cannot be in contact with sin. He can't be in the same room with evil and with anything that diminishes his own glory. You see, God exists in and only for himself. This is called God's aseity. And because of that, God cannot be in contact with sin. Yet, he created human beings with whom he desires relationship. Therefore, we have this broken model where God desires relationship, yet he cannot be in relationship with the creatures that have chosen to fall and to choose against him, to rebel against him. So something must happen to satisfy God's anger and righteous wrath against sin. God is vehemently opposed against sin because he himself, by his very nature, is holy. He is without sin. So God is opposed to sin. He cannot be in its contact. So Jesus Christ dies to satisfy God's wrath against sin. Jesus is punished in the place of sinners in order to satisfy the justice of God and the legal demand of God to punish sin. God must be true to his very nature. Sin is against his very nature and must be punished. Therefore, Jesus Christ gave himself, that's the substitution part, and he is punished, that's the penal part, in order to satisfy the justice of God and the wrath of God against sin. This is propitiation. Propitiation. We used this word earlier. Propitiation is satisfying God's wrath against sin, and essentially that wrath was taken out on the person of Jesus Christ, who gave himself willingly to be punished in the place of the sinner, in this way meeting the retributive requirements of God's justice. Now, this theory of the atonement contrasts with Anselm's satisfaction theory in that God is not satisfied with the debt of justice being paid, but that God is satisfied with punishing Jesus in the place of mankind. This is very dark, and it's the penal substitution theory, but it's the primary theory of the atonement that's held by evangelicals today. The notion that the cross acts upon God, conditioning him to forgiveness, originates from Anselm's theory, but here, in penal substitution, the means are different. This theory of the atonement is perhaps the most dominant today, especially among the Reformed and the evangelical. Again, a quote from Stephen T. Morrison. Now, number 6, governmental theory. Governmental theory. So in the governmental theory, we see a slight variation upon the penal substitution theory, which is notably held in Methodism. So those who are Methodist in the world generally tend to see the theory of the atonement that is the most appropriate as the governmental theory. In the governmental theory, Jesus Christ suffers the punishment of our sin and propitiates God's wrath, as we talked about in the previous. In this way, it is similar to penal substitution, of course. However, in the governmental theory, Jesus Christ does not take the exact punishment we deserve. He takes a punishment. Jesus dies on the cross, therefore, to demonstrate the displeasure of God towards sin. He died to display God's wrath against sin and the high price which must be paid, but not to specially satisfy that particular wrath. Now, I think that you can see some weaknesses there automatically, and that is trying to sort of soften the death and suffering of Jesus Christ, in that he doesn't have to take on the hate and the suffering and the sin and the woes and the wars of the entire world upon himself, to the extent that God has to literally turn his face away because he cannot bear the suffering of his son. But within the governmental theory, he suffers a punishment, not the ultimate punishment. And I think anyone can see that that becomes a little bit weak. Finally, number 7, scapegoat theory. Scapegoat theory. This is a modern atonement theory rooted in the philosophical concept of the scapegoat. Now, in the Old Testament, in the old ceremonial law of the Hebrew Bible, there were times when a goat was brought before the entire people, and the priest before God put his hand upon the goat, and in so doing imparted all of the sins of the entire corporate body of the Israelite people upon the goat, and then released the goat into the wilderness to face whatever eventualities might emerge from that. And so this is where the scapegoat comes from, in that the goat becomes guilty for the sins of the people, and all those sins are imparted upon the head of the goat by the hand of the priest as he imparts these sins, the corporate sins of an entire body of people, and then releases the goat. And the goat ultimately lives or dies or survives, and one is not entirely sure what the end result of that might be, but the scapegoat has taken the sins of the entire people. So the model is similar, in that here we see Jesus is killed by a violent crowd. The violent crowd kills him, believing that he's guilty. Jesus is proven innocent as the true Son of God. The crowd is therefore deemed guilty. And that's where the scapegoat theory sort of backfires upon itself, in that in this way, the scapegoat did not actually take upon itself the sins of the entire world, but rather the sins of the entire world are revealed by placing them upon the scapegoat. Now, in conclusion, I would like to note that there is an element of truth to almost all of these, except the theory of ransom to Satan. There is no scriptural evidence that Satan is owed anything, because God is the great king of the universe. He owes Satan nothing. And so in all of these, there seems a little bit of an element of truth. Moral influence. Did Christ enact a moral influence by being an incredible example and a martyr of the faith? Yes, of course. In ransom theory, was something owed? Yes. Sin is a debt that is owed back to God the Father, who is truly holy. In Christus Victor, was Christ victorious over sin and death? Absolutely he was. Absolutely he was in every way, so there's truth there. In satisfaction, we see clearly the concept of propitiation, that God's wrath against sin, his anger, his hatred of sin, is satisfied and is calmed by the death of Christ, who pays that debt against sin. Penal substitutionary theory. We absolutely see truth here. Christ gave himself as a substitute. The law is enacted against him. The penal substitutionary theory is very strong. In governmental theory, like we said, this is a bit of a slight variation upon penal substitutionary theory. We see truth here is that Jesus dies, pays the price against God's wrath, and is punished. And in scapegoat theory, we see the picture of the scapegoat from the Old Testament, in which the corporate sins that are collected from the entire people are placed upon one other entity. In this case, Christ himself. Christ gives himself freely as the scapegoat and takes upon himself those sins. He also sacrifices himself. We see from the book of Hebrews that Jesus Christ is the great high priest, but he is also the sacrifice that is made by the great high priest. And so he is the sacrifice and sacrifices himself in the substitutionary act by which he goes to the cross to take upon himself all of the sins of humanity. And God is so pained that he must look away from his son, who is so covered and mottled by the sins of the world, but who did so willingly, knowing that, and knowing what the princes of this world, if you recall the scripture from earlier, did not know. And that is that it would break the power of sin and break the power of death. And so I hope that you have enjoyed this discussion of the person of Christ and theories of the atonement. May you all be blessed wherever you are found in the world.